It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sandra Rebok. She is a German historian of knowledge and ideas. She is an author, speaker, and scientific consultant. Her research focuses on exploration voyages, the globalization of science, and intellectual networks during the 19th century. With 25 years of experience in Humboldt scholarship, she is the author of several books on Humboldt and the editor of 3 of his works in Spanish. And you can find these works on her website, sandrarebok.net. Her most recent book discusses Humboldt's intellectual exchange with Thomas Jefferson, and her forthcoming monograph analyzes his position between the Spanish Empire and the expanding United States. On the occasion of the Humboldt 250th anniversary in 2019, as a science advisor for the German Foreign Ministry and the German Institute for Foreign Relations, she carried out a research project on Humboldt's perception in Latin America and gave lectures in Europe, North and South America. We are so delighted to host Dr. Sandra Rebok today. This lecture was actually originally scheduled for last spring in advance of the exhibition at the Smithsonian's American Art Museum. And Sandra, we weren't sure when international travel would resume, so thank you for joining us today from Spain. So help me welcome Dr. Sandra Rebok.
Thank you, Gretchen, for the nice introduction. Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to present my work on Homeboy. So I would like to thank the Office of Historic Alexandria and the Alexandria Association for the invitation. I usually, with my perspective on Humboldt is from history of knowledge and ideas, intellectual history, Atlantic history, as well as also approaches from the political history. So what I try to do is to not only to look at Humboldt as an isolated figure in history, but to see how he was tied to the context in which he lived. So this is what I'm going to do with the lecture today, Serendipity or Destiny, Alexander von Humboldt's visit to Washington. During the first days of June 1804, Alexander von Humboldt was a guest of President Jefferson in the White House. This was at the end of his 5-year exploration voyage through Spanish America, dedicated to the study of the natural history. Humboldt's visit to Washington is the focus of my lecture, which is going to have 3 parts. The first part is an introduction to his life and his main achievements. Who was Humboldt, basically, for those who are less familiar to him. In the second part, I focus on his visit to Washington. And in the third part, in a way, I connect the local with the global. So what I'm going to look at is what were the reasons for his travels to the United States and how was his visit to the US connected to his larger goals. Alexander von Humboldt was born in 1769 into a prominent and wealthy family settled in Berlin and with close ties to the Prussian court. His father was a major in the Prussian army and the royal chamberlain. His mother came from a Huguenot family, so these are French Protestants who emigrated to Prussia. Young Alexander spent most of his childhood at the family estate, Schloss Tegel, together with his older brother Wilhelm von Humboldt, who would later become a celebrated linguist, philosopher, and diplomat. And also in the US, he is basically known for the model of higher education that he inspired, the Humboldtsche Bildungsideal. Both brothers maintained a close connection throughout their entire life, both intellectually and socially. Their mother, Maria Elisabeth, pursued the best possible education for their sons, hiring outstanding personalities as private tutors. Among them were Joachim Heinrich Campe, a well-known writer, and Gottlieb Johann Christian Kund, who became quite influential especially after the early death of the father of Alexander and Wilhelm. Also, the Jewish community in Berlin left its mark on the brothers' educational values through the salons they maintained as a privileged cultural and social space in enlightened Berlin. Later, Alexander pursued his studies at the universities of Göttingen and Frankfurt and at the Academy of Commerce in Hamburg, and after that at the famous Mining Academy in Freiburg, Saxony. So he got a very broad education. This is what we can see. And he got influences from many different people. So there were excellent mentors and teachers who gave him important intellectual impulses during his upbringing. And in this way, they contributed considerably to the development of his ideas and convictions. And in a way, it's interesting if we look at his ideas and if we look at his mentors in a more close way, we can really connect the dots and see where he got influences from whom. Next. Humboldt grew up in the era of great expeditions carried out by famous explorers such as Louis Antoine de Bougainville, James Cook, and Alessandro Malaspina and José de Bustamante y Guerra. This had a decisive impact on him. The adventurous descriptions of these journeys fascinated him from his early youth and formed his longing for the exotic world. So at the beginning, his destination was not at all clear. It was more a passion, and what he looked at was more exotic worlds, tropical worlds. In the spring of 1790, he took an important step in that direction because he had the opportunity to accompany the famous naturalist and travel writer Georg Forster on a journey to the Netherlands, England, and France. Forster had accompanied James Cook on his second exploration voyage, along with his father, the naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster. In his diaries, Humboldt described how his first visit to London, and particularly his encounter with the famous naturalist Joseph Banks, inspired him and defined his own vocation as a naturalist. Here, he also admitted that it was Georg Forster who much influenced him on his own path to becoming an explorer. However, it was not in England, but in France, where Humboldt got offered a long-awaited opportunity to participate in a government-sponsored exploration voyage. When the French government decided in 1798 to carry out a voyage to the Pacific, Humboldt was invited to form part of the group of distinguished naturalists on board. In fact, it was Bougainville himself, who was the first French explorer who had circumnavigated the Earth. He extended the invitation to Humboldt, and Humboldt was very proud of this distinction because it also shows that Humboldt, already before starting his American expedition, he had a certain fame as a naturalist. He had already a certain name, and that's why he was invited. However, things didn't work out the way Humboldt expected. And first, the French Directory, they decided to replace Bougainville, who was then already 70 years old, to replace him as a commander of the expedition with the younger but less experienced naturalist, Nicolas Thomas Baudin. Humboldt wasn't excited about that because he already knew that with Baudin he was going to have difficulties, but anyway, there were even more difficulties to come, economic and political reasons, and therefore the venture was first delayed, and then it faced other obstacles. So they couldn't leave at that moment. And Humboldt, who had inherited a considerable family fortune because his mother then had passed away, he was in the position to decide that this wouldn't be an hindrance to him, that he was going to start his own exploration voyage in a different way. And he invited the French botanist Aimé Bonpland to join him. Bonpland had already also been invited to join the same exploration voyage. So they were both waiting in Paris for the exploration voyage to start. So they got to know each other, and Humboldt invited him. They had still another idea, and the next possibility they saw on the horizon was to join Napoleon's expedition to Egypt and Syria. Napoleon had, who was then a commander, he had left a few months earlier, and their ideas was to go to Marseille in southern France, from there take a boat to Egypt and join the exploration party there. That also would not work out. We go to the next slide. And once again, Humboldt and Napoleon, they had to reconsider their itinerary and had to see, what was their next. They were at that moment, they were really impatient to begin their scientific adventure. And so the initial idea was to go to Spain and to spend there the winter on the Mediterranean coast, especially in Valencia. They had heard about the bad weather there, so the idea was to stay there, and then after the winter to pursue other possibilities. But when they were in Spain, they noticed that here the stars seemed to be aligned for their scientific endeavor. So they, from Valencia, they decided to go to Madrid. This was at the beginning of 1799. They got introduced to the new Secretary of State, Mariano Luis de Urquijo, who was known for being an enlightened mind. They had the same age. He was very favorable to any scientific enterprise in general. He had initiated also other exploration voyages, and he was also an enthusiast of mineralogy, like Humboldt, who had studied in the mining academy of Freiberg. So Urquijo strongly endorsed Humboldt's project and introduced him to the Spanish monarch, Charles IV. And it was in March of 1799 when Humboldt was invited to the royal court at Aranjuez, which is south of Madrid. And this is what we see here on the picture. Next. At the Spanish court, Humboldt, he presented what we would present today if we want the project to get sponsored or authorized. This is on one side, it's a kind of CV, it's a description of his life and a description of the project. So he handed it over, and the Spanish monarchy was impressed by his achievements. And he gave Humboldt an exceptionally generous travel authorization. So in fact, the passport, we see it here on the left, the passport that Humboldt received was, we shouldn't understand it in the way we understand a passport today. It was more a combination of a safe conduct and a letter of recommendation. So it was in very, very general, very liberal terms. So basically he could do whatever he wanted. He could travel wherever he wanted, stay as long as he liked. He could be in all parts of the Spanish domains, not only in America, but also in Asia, for example. He could have gone to Philippines. That's also what he wanted to do at some point. He didn't do it for several other reasons. But here it's important to understand that that it was very generous, and that Homeboy, he paid for his own travels. So there was no payment involved from the Spanish side, but it was the possibility to explore in a very, very free way and stay as long as he wanted to. He was also allowed to have access to the colonial archives, etc. There were only two conditions what he had to comply with. That was to send collections to the Royal Botanical Garden and to the Royal Cabinet of Natural History in Madrid. Okay, so next slide. They left from northwestern Spain, La Coruña, in May of 1799, and they left for what would become their 5-year expedition through Spanish America. And this is what Humboldt was basically famous for this exploration voyage. I would like to point to 3 important things in this context. One is that they had a very, very broad goal. Basically, they wanted to understand all the different phenomena and see how they were connected, but not only only that. So he was not only interested as a naturalist with a holistic and global approach to understand, let's say, nature. He was also very much interested in all social aspects, in economic aspect, political aspect. So instead of seeing him just as a natural scientist, we should see him much broader as a social scientist, cultural scientist, historian. He worked a lot in the archives. So it's much broader than just being a naturalist dedicated to one specific scientific project. And also what we should keep in mind is when we look at his travels, then he traveled in the Spanish possession. So it's not the countries that we know today, and this would be Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and Cuba. But it was at his time, it was the viceroyalties of New Spain, of New Granada, Peru, which has had a totally different extension to what it has today, and the island of Cuba. And third, it's important to know that during the entire expedition, he was accompanied by Bonpland. I say that because sometimes there's a tendency that we just talk about Humboldt without mentioning Bonpland, but we should mention him. And then also from Quito onwards, there was a third person accompanying them, and that was Carlos Montúfar Hilaria. He was the son of the Marquis of Selva Negra, so they were the owners of an hacienda outside of Quito, where Humboldt and Bonpland, they were invited to stay there for a while, and then they were asked if they could take Montúfar with them. Montúfar was not a naturalist; he was rather known for his revolutionary ideas. At the end of the expedition through Spanish America, they added a 6 weeks visit to the United States, but I'm not going to talk about that now, but later. So next slide. When they returned after the 5 years, when they returned to Europe in August of 1804, they went to Paris. This was for several reasons, not only because Bonpland returned to where he lived, but also because Paris at that moment was the capital of sciences in Europe. So for very obvious reasons, if you wanted to be connected to the most advanced sciences, have the best scientific or academic infrastructure, to be connected with the most outstanding naturalists, the newest theories, etc. So then Paris was the place to be. Humboldt managed to live there until 1827. And this was when the Prussian king, he demanded him back to Berlin. He had already done that many, many years before, but Humboldt was so convinced that he needed to be in Paris that he found his ways to extend his stays, and extended longer, but that in 27 it wasn't possible anymore. And this also had to do with the fact that he had spent all his wealth, all his money. He has spent it on his exploration voyage, but also later on the elaboration of the results, like the books and everything. So he paid it out of his own expenses. Next slide. The British Empire. This is just briefly to mention that that Humboldt, from the beginning, he had also a very a comparative approach. So for him, it was not only interesting to, let's say, to recollect data from America, but he wanted to compare that with Asia. So that's why he was sure that he wanted to undertake another exploration voyage, this time through the Spanish possessions. Also there, he was quite open, quite flexible. He thought about India, Nepal, Himalaya, or other places. But it did not work out. So in this case, so he tried it through different channels and through influential channels. But in this case, he did not get the permission that he expected to get. And apparently it was due to struggles between the British Crown and the East India Company. So that made it difficult. However, and that's what we see at the next slide. What is less known is that after his relocation to Berlin In April 1829, Humboldt embarked on a second major exploration voyage, this time through broad regions of Russia, where he went as far as the Siberian borders. And this was an invitation by the Tsar Nicholas I, who allowed him to elaborate exactly this comparative studies that he wanted to do. However, the scholarly scope of this expedition was mainly limited to his studies in the field of mineralogy. In other words, Humboldt was, in that case, you could say, well, not hired because he wasn't paid for it, but all the expenses were paid. So he was invited for that 8-month exploration voyage. But yes, he was basically expected to contribute with his expertise in the field of mineralogy. And this is what he did. It was important, it was still important to him, but you can never compare it in its importance or the impact it had. You cannot compare it to the American expedition. And this is basically because it was very restricted. So he was very much under control of the Russian authorities. This is something he did not like at all. He was rather unhappy about it. And when he got a second invitation to go to Russia, he declined it. He didn't want to repeat that experience. Next slide. So the last years in Berlin, and this was over 30 years, so from 27 to 59, this is when he passed away in 1859 at the age of almost 90 years, while he was still working on the 5th volume of his Cosmos, is when he passed away. And what he left behind was a large legacy, a collection of 60,000 different plant species, many of them that were previously unknown. Then he had an abundant assortment of geological, zoological, botanical, or ethnographic material. And also important observation on Spanish America prior to the independence movement that started a few years later. So that is also very important. And that is basically what we could find in his diaries, because he was cautious. He did not publish everything that he had noted down in his diaries because he had to be careful. But especially in his diaries, we can find a lot of critical comment also on the colonial system, and that is an important document now because we can see a very detailed description of the situation, of life, of the economic situation, etc. Before everything changed and the new nations emerged. He published a large number of books. Some are very textual. They have many texts, like the Cosmos, for example. Others have a lot of images in them. So some are very specific. They treat a specific type of measurements. Others are more a more general travel narrative, for example. Or then we have his we have regional descriptions on Cuba and on New Spain. So it's very diverse, his oeuvre, and it had been translated to several languages and has been used by countless subsequent travelers and explorers as inspiration or as reference. Next slide. So now we get to the second part, Humboldt's visit to Washington. Here we see his itinerary through the United States. He arrived on May 20th in 1804 on the Delaware River, before getting to Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is where he passed, where he spent the first time, and then from there, together with other people, but we're going to talk more about that a little later. They traveled from Philadelphia to Washington via Chester, Wilmington, Charlestown, Baltimore, Vanville, and Bladensburg. They arrived in Washington and spent there the first 13 days of June. where they had several times meetings with President Jefferson and members of his cabinet. From there, they went via Lancaster and Downingtown back to Philadelphia. They spent another time in Philadelphia, and then on June 30th is when they had the opportunity to get on a ship that was about to leave to Bordeaux, France. And they had other plans at that moment, but they decided that it was an excellent opportunity to travel back to Europe and to travel back to France. Next slide. Philadelphia. So the scholarly circles at the American Philosophical Society. So this is what I represent on this slide. The American Philosophical Society was, let's say, the hub for Humboldt in Philadelphia. They were the social intellectual center for his visit. The members of the society established important contacts in town. He received significant support. They guided him through the scholarly infrastructure of the city, invited him to give lectures. They gave him an introduction to the state of American science. And they offered him accommodation and also invited him to social gatherings. And also they gave him the possibility to give lectures where he talked about his expedition. So, and also what we can see here on the slide is through the American Philosophical Society, Humboldt received his first academic distinction in the United States. So just after he had left, they made him a member. Besides that, they also went to the Library Company of Philadelphia, the College of Pennsylvania, and the Botanical Garden that had been established by John and William Bartram. So Philadelphia was, his stay there was very, very important because this is where he started his scholarly networks in the United States. So all started in Philadelphia, but this lecture is on Washington, and so this is what we're going to focus on now. Next slide. When from Philadelphia, when they were in Philadelphia, Humboldt sent a letter of introduction to Jefferson. It was really, it's a masterpiece of diplomacy, and he basically mentioned all different topics that he thought could be of interest for Jefferson or could pique Jefferson's curiosity in one way or the other. So if we read this document, we become aware of that Jefferson basically he couldn't otherwise than inviting Humboldt to Washington or to the White House, and this is what he did. But before we talk more about the invitation, his meeting with Jefferson, etc., I would like to say a few words on the state of the sources. That is what we see on the next slide. So regarding the travel to Washington, here we have one problem is regarding the sources that Humboldt normally during his entire expedition through Spanish America, he noted down his observation, his comments, but also data, measurements, etc. in his travel diaries. And this is exactly what is missing for his visit in the United States. And this is very unfortunate because through the diaries, as I said before, we get interesting comments before he would polish his comments and publish his annotations in his work. So it would have been very important, or it is very important that these documents will be found. I just mentioned that. So because they might as well be somewhere in the United States, so we don't know. Some parts of it have already been found, and here we see on the left side we see some annotations, but it's just a few pages, so that can't be all. And it's basically about some plans, some conversations he had, etc. But it's only very, very partial. and besides the diaries, also normally in Spanish America, what he did is he wrote a lot of letters, and in the letters, especially to those people with whom he had more confidence, he would tell in detail what he was doing, what he was planning to do next, the reasons, etc. So this is another thing that we don't have in the case of the United States. So that the good thing, the advantage is that the entire visit to Washington, so the travel to Washington, the stay in Washington, he did that together with Charles Willson Peale. And Peale had very detailed annotations of the travels, and we can read that. So there is an excellent publication of his letters, his travel diaries, and also his autobiography, where years later he recalls those travels with Alexander von Humboldt. So basically, what I'm going to tell you now about different places they visited, this is taken from Peale's descriptions. On May 29, in the company of Charles Willson Peale, the English physician Thomas Fothergill, and the Reverend Nicholas Collin, the explorers set off by coach for Washington. Washington was, since 1800, the new capital. Before leaving, Peale had prepared some black and white profiles from Humboldt to present them as a gift for the people they expected to meet in Washington. With his trip to Washington, Peale pursued a personal project that was very dear to him. Over many years, he had advocated to obtain funding for his museum and has propagated his idea to convert it into the first official National Museum of Natural History of the young nation. Accompanying the famous Prussian naturalist to the new capital seemed for him the perfect moment to approach the president. His hope was to receive Humboldt's endorsement for his project, and with such an influential support from the European visitor, he believed Jefferson would be more accessible for his important vision. So this was basically his motivation. So the group reached Washington at the beginning of June. They spent the first 2 weeks in and around the new capital, visiting Capitol building, the library, the Senate chamber, as well as the Navy Yard. For his personal meetings with the president, Humboldt was provided with 2 letters of recommendations issued by both officers of the APS, Wister and Barton. So Wister introduced the European visitor as two very respectable travelers who are now on their way to the seat of government for the purpose of offering their respect. Whereas Barton calls Humboldt one of the most intelligent and active philosophers of our time, who regretted that his stay in the United States could not be extended at this point. With these flattering descriptions, Jefferson must have been very curious to meet his guest. And it was on June 4th, just after they arrived, that Humboldt met him for the first time. And then the party was invited at the president's house, as the White House was called then, to a very elegant dinner. As Peale records in his diaries, according to usual politeness, Jefferson received this gentleman in the most friendly manner. He seemed to be very content with the conversation during this evening. And Peale says in his diaries, he was also very happy because not a single toast was given or called for, or politics touched upon, I'm citing Peale, but subjects of natural history and improvement of the conveniences of life. From the notes of the artist's diaries, we also know that Jefferson had known before the high reputation of the Baron as a philosopher and ingenious observer of nature, who had traveled a great deal. As mentioned, they also visited the Navy Yard in Washington, which had been established just a few years prior. And this is one of the places that Humboldt mentions in that little piece of his diaries that has been found, what I showed before. So here he mentioned that they visited the Navy Yard. He mentioned the date, and he remarked, and this is a quote, "The US Navy in its current state has frigates that rot very quickly, especially where the wood is too thick and air does not circulate." We also find some more comments in this little annotations. For example, that he had talked to Jefferson about Jefferson's vocabulary list of Indian languages of North America, and that he compared that to his to the notes he had taken of in South America. And also in those travel diaries and those annotations that he did during his visit in Washington, he also there's one part where he gives information on prices for accommodation, for provision, transportation, clothing, etc. in Washington. For example, he compares the price of a bottle of porter beer consumed at an inn with its price in town, which is, if you're interested, it's $0.50 versus $0.25. And yeah, so this is it's very, let's say, this type of annotation, it's not a narrative, it's just information he throws in, but then later he uses it for his elaborations. Next slide. During this time, during the time in Washington, they also left to visit Alexandria, and this is what we find in Peele's narrative. So he doesn't give a lot of information because it was basically they wanted to go to Mount Vernon. But Peele mentions that they had dinner in a tavern. So this is one doubt I have, is if this might have been the Gatsby Tavern, which was a place Jefferson liked to go. So I don't know if there were many other options. I've been trying to find that out, but maybe you are more knowledgeable about that than I am. So they went to a tavern in Alexandria, and next slide. On their way to Mount Vernon, because they wanted to show their respect to Washington, who had passed away 5 years prior to that. And in fact, this is something that Humboldt did note in his travel diaries. So in December of 1799, when he was in South America, he received the information about Washington's death, and he commented on that in his travel annotations. So at that moment, apparently they had the expectation that Bushrod Washington, the nephew of Washington, who had inherited the property, that he was there, but he was not there. Peele mentioned that they kind of had hoped to have dinner at Mount Vernon, but it was impossible. They were hungry and they had to beg some bread. So they weren't able to make the connections in the way they would have wished. But anyway, it was impressive for them to be able to visit Mount Vernon. Next slide. In the course of his stay in the capital, Humboldt also became acquainted with Secretary of State James Madison and Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin, as well as the architect, inventor, and physician William Thornton. They frequently invited the Prussian and his companions to social events or dinners at their homes. Thornton accompanied Humboldt to Georgetown, where they both visited the French and British ambassadors, Louis-André Pichon and Anthony Murray, respectively. When I read that, again in Peele's diaries, I was surprised that they did not meet the Spanish ambassadors, because since they had been just traveling through the Spanish colonies for 5 years, and whenever they went to a new place in Spanish America, they were received and they were invited, etc. So I wondered, why they didn't visit the Spanish representative in Washington. But then I found out that at that moment they were both in Philadelphia. the ambassador and also the consul. The ambassador because he preferred to be in Philadelphia, and the consul because this is where he was generally based. So yeah, in general, Humboldt seemed to feel very comfortable in Washington, expanding his networks with the people that had similar enlightened ideas and values. There were many letters. So if we read his letters from before he left, he expresses that very openly. He says that the days he spent in Washington were the most delightful of his life, and he felt great moral joy above all that physical nature is able to offer, to understand and sympathize with each other in feelings regarding social happiness. So this is what he said. But anyway, they had to leave. They had to leave Washington, so they went. The three of them, Humboldt, Bonpland, Montoufa, they went to Lancaster, where they paid a visit to the botanist Gottfried Henry Ernst Muhlenberg and the surveyor Andrew Ellicott. They reached Lancaster's. No, from Lancaster they returned to Philadelphia, where they remained for another 2 weeks, and then they had the opportunity to leave. All of a sudden, this opportunity appeared, and they decided to take it and to leave earlier than they wanted. They would have preferred to stay longer in the United States. Next slide. So now we should have a look at the political context. At what moment did Humboldt and his companions, at what moment did they visit the United States? And this is the next slide. This happened right after the Louisiana Purchase and the beginning of a series of exploration voyages into the West, when his expertise was of particular importance for the young nation. So this is the map that we see. I think it's very important to become aware of, let's say, the geopolitical changes through the Louisiana Purchase, because when Humboldt left Europe, North America looked similar to what we can see on this map, which means we had a small part on the East Coast, which were the United States, but then the entire rest was Spanish. So it was New Spain, and then the Louisiana territory, which was huge. So this is how it looked. But then everything changed, and with the Treaty of San Ildefonso, which was in 1800, Spain sold the Louisiana territory. They sold it to France, and under one condition, and the condition was never ever sell it to the United States. And this is what France did, precisely that. That's what they did right away. They sold it to the US, and the US was able to double its size for only $15 million, which was a lot at that time. But still, if you have a look at the map, it's it's huge, the territory. So this means, and all this happened while Humboldt was in Spanish America. And all of a sudden, it was a different political panorama for him. And this is the moment when Humboldt decided to add a visit to the United States. So let's have a look at the next slide. Yeah. With this background, now we know why Jefferson was so interested in meeting Humboldt, not only as an experienced explorer, as someone who had just finished an exploration voyage for 5 years, and then obviously he had a lot to share with Jefferson, but also because he expected that Humboldt could give him some information on the newly purchased territories, because the problem was that the border region were not clearly defined. So in all of these transactions, from the Spanish to the French and then to the US, there were no clear definition, first of all, what the borders were, and also the content, so what was there. And at that moment, of course, the United States wouldn't get the information from Spain, because they disagreed on where the borders were, because each country argued its own favor. And the French basically said, well, you'll find it out yourself. So this is why Jefferson thought, oh, Humboldt's visit couldn't be better timed. And he right away he asked him about the questions of limits of the Louisiana between Spain and the United States. So this is what we see here, the quotation. They claim, so this is the Spanish, he says, well, what the Spanish claim and what the US claims. So he would like to have Humboldt's opinion on that. And he also says, can the Bern inform me about what population may be between those lines of white, red, or black people, and whether any or what minds are within them? So the information would be very thankfully received. This is what he said. Humboldt arrived in the U.S. just after the Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase, and the first exploration voyage of a series of exploration voyages that Jefferson was planning at that moment. So the Louis-Claude expedition, it was just the first one, but they just had left before Humboldt arrived. So there was, unfortunately, there was no personal encounter. Otherwise, it could have been very interesting to them. Again, also because Humboldt, he knew how to do an exploration voyage, he knew how to do all type of measurements, etc. But see, what Jefferson did is he asked Humboldt specific things, and then he would report and send this information to Lewis and Clark in the letters of instructions that he sent to them. So in a way, some of the information that Humboldt was able to give, but more on not strategic information, more on how to do an exploration voyage, how to use certain measurements, certain instruments, how to do certain measurements, etc. This is the information that they got. Next slide. Back to Jefferson's questions and Humboldt's replies. So Humboldt passed him information. And this is something that has received quite some attention and also criticism. He has been criticized from multiple sides about for the fact that he has passed information to Jefferson. At this moment, we don't have much time to look at that in detail. I do that in other lectures where we really analyze what he passed. And to summarize, I can say basically it was material that he had prepared at the request of Spanish authorities while he was in the city of Mexico in New Spain. And one was the director of the mining school in Mexico, Fausto de Luyer. He had asked him to prepare a map with of New Spain, with indicating the locations of the mines. That is what he was interested in. Humboldt did that, and that is what we see, the first draft of it. This is what we see on the left. And José de Iturrigaray, he was the vice king of New Spain. He had, when he gave Humboldt access to all the archives, etc., he said, well, he would like to have a kind of report where Humboldt would gather all type of information that he had been gathering in those archives. And this is what we see on the right. So it's called Tablas Geográfico-Políticos del Reino de la Nueva España. And this is information that he made accessible to Jefferson, so the map, but also he did not, because the report was written in Spanish, so he did not pass that report to Jefferson, but he made an extract of it. So he took some parts out, translated them into French, but he also, very wisely, he added other information that he thought should be of interest for Jefferson, or things that he wanted that Jefferson knew. So that is what he did. And then he also drafted another text, but not text, more annotations with statistical data, etc. And this is specifically on the Louisiana territory. So these are the three things that he passed Jefferson. Let's go to the next slide. Sometimes people wonder or they think that Jefferson did not have much information on Spanish America at that moment. That's why I really would like to point out that Jefferson knew a lot. Jefferson had a lot of different sources, and in fact, already since the time when he was in Europe as a representative of the American of the United States. Already in the 1780s, he tried to gather all type of material on Spanish America. So that's what he said. While I was in Europe, I had purchased everything I could lay my hand on, which related to any part of America, and particularly had a pretty full collection of the Spanish, French, and English, French, and Spanish authors on the subject of Louisiana. So here we can see he had a lot of information, and also this is what we see at the next slide. At the moment of Humboldt's visit, he had many different sources. Sources are of course, General James Wilkinson. He was a U.S. Army officer. He was his main source of information on Texas and northern New Spain, but he was a quite dubious character. Then other sources were, for example, Philip Nolan, a horse trader, or Charles Picton. He was the minister to Spain during that time of Humboldt's visit. So we got a lot of information, but Jefferson was someone who always liked to contrast information because he was a rather distrustful person. So he wanted to see if the information that he had received especially from Wilkinson, to see if that information was correct by contrasting it with what Humboldt was able to provide. Okay, next slide. We get to the last part, serendipity or destiny. The big question is, why did Humboldt add a visit to the United States? It was, let's say, after 5 years of experience in colonial Spanish America, getting to know the promising United States, to get to know the country personally and make the acquaintance of important personalities, that would be, in any case, a very important experience to him. But we also have to know that at that moment, when Humboldt visited the United States, was also a moment when he, after the 5 years, he was ready to go back. He was eager to go back to Europe as soon as possible. So adding this voyage, so that there had to be more reasons to it, and that was something that I was particularly interested in, to see what were these additional reasons, or let's say maybe even real reasons. Next slide. Since his studies in Hamburg, this means since the 1790s, he was in 1991, Humboldt became interested in the United States. He was lucky because when he was in Hamburg studying at the Academy of Commerce, he was a student of Christoph Daniel Ebeling, who was at that time, let's say, the expert on the United States in Germany. He had established his own networks, including with Jefferson. He had established a library with all type of books, material related to the United States. This is where Humboldt read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia in Ebeling's library in Hamburg. And Ebeling was also the first to publish a journal on the United States and to prepare a larger oeuvre on different parts of the United States, what we see here on the right. So at that moment, when he was a student there, he mentioned in one of his letters to other students, he mentioned that his mentor, Campe, was thinking about traveling to the United States, and Humboldt he was basically waiting to be invited. So he was very excited about the possibility that maybe he could be invited. So that's what he said in his letters. But at Campe, he wouldn't go to the United States. He wouldn't be invited. Also, another person who wanted to travel to the United States was Ebeling. This also didn't work out. And then Humboldt had his other possibilities. He went to Spanish America. But just when he was in Spanish America, in one of his letters, again to his friends of his youth. He says, a quotation that I personally like it very much, he says, ideas can only be useful if they come to life in the minds of many people. In North America, there are writers in whose heads I would like my ideas to live. Okay, next slide. Then it was in Cuba, and this is something where my research has shown me that we have some wrong interpretations, and that I was finding documents that showed that things actually had happened in a different way. This is what, well, it's the nature of doing research. Yeah, you find new documents, you find that challenge previous interpretations. So we have understood that it was in Havana where he changed his mind because it was the American representative there, Vincent Gray. He was in fact the vice consular commercial agent for the United States, that he had convinced him to go to the United States. But no, I found that in fact it was much before that Humboldt had already taken the decision to travel to the United States, and and this was in New Spain. So while he was in New Spain, and this is also what he confessed that to some Spanish travel companions, and they reported it back to Spain. So I read information in the Spanish official government documents where we can see that already from New Spain, he had the idea he wanted to go to the United States, and I see that that was strongly connected to the Louisiana Purchase, because he knew, this is when he was in New Spain, he heard about this significant territorial expansions, and he knew about Jefferson's vision for the West. So he could easily foresee the impact that the huge land purchase would have on the future of the United States. And he was also immediately aware of the intrinsic opportunities that would arise for him in the context of the scientific exploration of the newly acquired territory. Such a promising constellation on the horizon could well have convinced him that this was a perfect moment for a visit to the United States. Another reason was, this is the next slide, is Humboldt also, he was, let's say, he was eager not returning to Spain or to Europe on a Spanish boat, because that would have been a Spanish ship, because that would have been to Spain. This is what he wanted to avoid, because he was very much concerned about his manuscripts and his collections. And let's say there are several other cases in history where people who had been exploring in the Spanish territories, when they returned to Madrid, then the material was confiscated and even worse things happened to them. This was, for example, the example of the Malaspina expedition. Humboldt was very close to some of the members of the Malaspina expedition. So he was very eager not to return to Spain. And of course, this was another reason to go to the United States. But let me see in the next slide. And with this, we are almost getting to an end. Humboldt, he expressed, so I was trying to find his own voice to see what does he say, why did he go to the United States. But it's very difficult. We don't find an elaboration on that. Yeah? So that would have been interesting. So we have to compose it from different documents. We have to compose from different letters. And there's one letter where he says to James Madison, just before when he arrived in Philadelphia, this is what he says to James Madison: after having witnessed the great natural phenomena presented by the magic nature of the Andes, and having experienced the expressive natural world in South America, he considered it to be a great consolation to be able to enjoy, I quote, the moral spectacle presented by a free people worthy of their beautiful destiny. So that has again raised some some criticism, because people say, okay, yes, in South America he was interested in nature, in North America he was interested in the idea, as if there were no ideas in South America and no ideas and no nature in North America. But I understand this as a wrong interpretation, because when Humboldt was about to leave the country, he, first of all, he seemed to be certain to be that he would return soon to the country, and he had a strong desire to return. That's what they expressed in several occasions. So he he said, for example, he wished to see the United States again in a few years' time. This is what he wrote to Madison, when the way was open from the Missouri to the Pacific. In his opinion, the Great Lakes, Canada, and the land from Pittsburgh to the Rocky Mountains offered a vast opportunity for geological exploration. To William Thornton, he wrote, now that you can see it on the slide, you see the quotations. To William Thornton, but in French, in the French original version. So he wrote that he hoped to meet again one day in the United States, since, I quote, the country that stretches to the west of the mountains offers a vast field to conquer for the sciences. And to Albert Gallatin, he said, with some help or some aid from the US government, he, Humboldt, could undertake important research, possibly even traveling north as far as Mount Elias, St. Elias in Alaska and the Russian possessions. So what we can see here is Humboldt had a clear goal, and he had a clear wish to participate in this exploration, say, endeavor, in this undertakings. He wanted to form part of it, and he knew that for this he needed the support of the United States government, and especially Jefferson. So he knew about that was necessary to get Jefferson's support, and he also knew about Jefferson's interest for the exploration of the West. So reaching out to the political power and reaching out to Jefferson, who at that moment was not only the president of the United States, but also the president of the American Philosophical Society, which means that he connected, Jefferson, one person, he connected or combined, let's say, he was the political head of the nation, but also, say, a leading scientific figure, and that was, he was the key person to meet. So what I'm trying to say is, going back to the title, is that in my eyes, Humboldt's visit to the United States was not based on serendipity, but seemed to have been taken rather, he seems to have taken his United States, or a visit to the United States, as his destiny, because he saw the United States as the most fertile ground for future exploration voyages. However, despite these clear visions for a future active participation in the exploration of the American West, once back in Europe, he found himself caught up in many ambitious publishing projects, and then the other exploration voyage to Asia. So after having reconfirmed this idea so many times, and expressing how much he missed his American friends, when almost 30 years later he had still not been able to make the second visit, it was Madison who reminded him of that promise. He said, I quote Madison, "There might be little hope now that a fulfillment of your original intention would be compatible with the many interesting demands on your time elsewhere," he wrote. I can only assure you, therefore, that on a more favorable supposition, you would nowhere be more welcomed by more general gratulation than among the citizens of the United States. So Humboldt was not, even with this very kind invitation, he was not able to return, but he had established a very, very strong correspondence network, and it was really a collaboration network that would last from the moment of his visit until over 50 years later, until the end of his life. And through his networks, in a way, he was, or in an indirect way, he was able to participate in the exploration of the American West by providing his expertise and information, as well as by connecting people and ideas. We go to the last slide. Yeah. So for those who would like to know more about Humboldt's connection to the United States and to Jefferson in particular, and if you like to understand or to read more about Humboldt's navigation between the sciences and the politics, then I would like to point to my last book, Humboldt and Jefferson, and the forthcoming book, Empire of Knowledge from the Spanish Royal Court to the White House. Also, if you like to find out more about my work, you can visit my website or visit my Instagram account, Glimpses into the History of Ideas. So now, with a little delay, we go to the questions.
Sandra, we have a lot of really great questions. What languages did Humboldt speak?
He spoke well, German, French, Spanish, and English. In the United States, well, he communicated basically in English, and there are comments saying that Humboldt was quite fluent in English. His travel companions were not, so Bonpland and Matufa, they weren't, but Humboldt, he was. But apparently also what Humboldt did is he, since he changed constantly from one language to the other with his travel companions and also in his writings, he also did that with the people, speaking to the people in the US. So several people commented on that. They said, well, he sometimes he jumped from one language to the other, but basically it was let's say when he was speaking, then it was in English. When he wrote, then in French. So for example, if we look at his correspondence with Jefferson, he wrote in French, and Jefferson wrote him in English.
I see. Where could someone look at the Humboldt papers today? Is there one repository with the collection, or are they scattered throughout multiple institutions?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's more complicated than for example with the Jefferson medicine papers, etc., which are like edited in a chronological way. So they have been several editions already, but these they have been done at the Academy of Science and the Humboldt Research Center at the Academy of Science in Berlin. But they have only been edited, first of all, selective. So they don't include everything, but just portions of it, and only in German and in French. Well, those parts that have been written in French, and some parts have been translated into Spanish. But now what they have is, because a couple of years ago, the diaries, the travel diaries, they were in private possessions. It was the heritage of the family from Wilhelm von Humboldt. They in Schloss Tegel at the family estate. So they had the diaries there, and they sold them. So now they are at the National Library in Berlin. But there's a wonderful project that connects the Academy of Science, well, that Humboldt project at the Academy of Science with the University of Potsdam, and they're editing that, and you can find that online. So if you search for that, it's called something like Humboldt on the Move, or Humboldt. It's his travel diaries, but there they also they added letters. So it's a very, very broad project. It's a very ambitious project, and it's really, really important, because if we look at those original sources, then we can see that some of our interpretations have been wrong. Or for example, for much time, especially in the United States, where people have less access to those because you have to read German or French. Then there was, for example, the idea that Humboldt did not criticize very much the colonial circumstances in which he traveled, but yes, he did. But it's basically in his private annotations. And with regard to the letters, also we don't have a chronological and comprehensive edition, but they have been edited selectively with regard to certain countries or certain people or families or whatever. And there is one excellent edition of his correspondence with the United States. This has been published years ago in Berlin by one of the researchers at the Humboldt Project, Dr. Ingo Schwarz. But also the edition is German, but then the letters, they are in whatever language they have been written. So you can find French and English letters.
Great. Well, you mentioned that Humboldt made note of Washington's death when he received news during his expedition to Spanish America. So later on, when he was in DC, was the trip to Mount Vernon at Humboldt's request, or was that Peale's suggestion? What do you think?
Yeah. So this is basically what I think. Yeah, because as I said, unfortunately, we don't have. I would love to find letters of Humboldt where he gives his impressions, he comments on the plans they had there. There we just have to rely on what Peale says, and he doesn't give any explanations. He says the group, they wanted to give their respect to Washington, going to Mount Vernon. I believe it might not have been Humboldt who suggested it. But again, maybe he was, we don't know. But even if he wasn't the person who suggested it, then he must have been thrilled to go there, because this is, as I said before, in his annotations, he made a comment on when the news reached him that Washington had passed away. And so
I love your potential reference to Gadsby's Tavern. We'll have to pull out Peale's description and also check the local newspapers and see if we can.
I did with Peale's description. I did, because a couple of years ago I was invited to a dinner at Gadsby Tavern. Of course, when since they make all the references to the people that have been there, I was curious. But then if you look at Peale's description, he says, we went to the tavern. So that's why I don't know if there were many other taverns, or if at that moment, if you said the tavern, that it meant the Gadsby Tavern.
Right.
So, but yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of taverns in Alexandria, but of course, most people on this call know that I'm very biased, but of course, Gadsby's is the tavern. so anyway, we'll have to explore that.
Something that might help is when Peale sat down in the tavern, and then he says in his annotations, he says, well, sitting here makes me kind of sad, because I'm thinking about last time I was here was Washington. So that means many years before that he had been to Alexandria, and this was when he was doing the painting of Washington. And in that occasion he had gone to Alexandria, and apparently he had met was Washington in that tavern. So again, we have to know if the Gadsby Tavern was the tavern that Washington would like to go to. Right, but this is what I leave to people in Alexandria or the surroundings to find that out.
Well, you've given us some tasty clues, so thank you.
And I would be interested in getting results of that research. Yeah. So if you find out something, please let me know.
Sure. Okay, our next question. Did he visit the gardens of John Bartram?
Yes, that's what they visited, yes.
Okay, great. Did Humboldt visit the United States also to learn more about the American democracy and how it worked? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, definitely. As I said before, we should not see Humboldt only as a naturalist, as someone interested in animals or plants. He was very much interested in politics, in economy, and also there he applies the same, let's say, holistic approach that he does in the natural world. Like in nature, he's interested to see how the growth of the plant connects with the temperature or the height or whatever, all these different criteria. Also in let's say in the political social sector. He was very much interested in economic questions, and this of course has to do with the fact that he studied economy in Hamburg with Ebeling, and their question, of course, the question is, if you compare colonial America or colonial Spanish America with the United States in terms of politics or economy, what is the difference, and what are the reasons for the differences? In other words, how can a free society, how can that improve also the economic, the economy of the nation? And that, of course, is again a political question. So Humboldt, he was not a politician, but he was very much interested in, Johnny was very much interested, now I can see you. He was very much interested in improving the living conditions of the people. So this was something that he showed from the beginning, from very young, when he was working as a mining engineer. Even this is when he started. So he that's why he was interested also in politics, to see what are the bases that can provide a better, let's say, better conditions for the people to live. And also he says, well, in that letter, the letter he mentioned when he was a student in Hamburg, when he mentioned that his mentor was going to the United States, he says, well, he wants to study the Constitution of the United States, and he wants to study, let's say, the conditions, the political conditions of that nation, that he would be very much interested in joining this expedition. So of course, yes, he was interested in, because he thought all connected, because the political system has a big impact on the society, has a big societal impact on how people were living under which circumstances.
So Humboldt was really well known in his own time, but he's not really a name most people, at least here in the United States, are very familiar with. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? And do his ideas live on in the United States as he hoped they would?
Well, yeah, these are two important questions. One is, why would people forget about him? It's, let's say, part of the answer applies to the United States, but part of it applies to his reception in general, because in every country, his reception or his perception is a different one, and in the United States, let's say, it was always the German community there who very much kept his memory alive. So for them, connecting to Humboldt or using his name, because it was them who used his names when they founded a new settlement, a new town, or when first street for restaurants, and then also Freeman, for example, when he was exploring the West, he named places after Humboldt. So his name was very present at those times. But then there was a time when German immigrants, they were more assimilated, so they had lost connections to Europe. And then, of course, with the First World War, and then the Second, let's say, people would not show that strongly their German connections anymore. Let's say, being German or being from German descendants at that time, it was more something you better hide. So at least it was nothing that they wanted to proudly show as it was before. And then, so this applies to the United States, but then in general, it was also that the fact that the year Humboldt passed away, 1859, is when Charles Darwin published his groundbreaking work on the origin of the species. And here he advocated a totally different approach to nature, which was not based on a harmonic system like in Humboldt's case, but a struggle of the fittest, a struggle for survival. So this is a totally different world. And of course, that in a way, let's say, made that Humboldt's ideas were considered a bit more obsolete, etc. Another reason is, and this also applies not only in the United States, but in general, that in the second half of the 19th century, the sciences started to specialize. So you had you had to be more specialized in different branches. So then Humboldt's global holistic approach wasn't that, let's say, fashionable anymore. But this is precisely what has changed over the last years, that people become more and more aware that Humboldt's approach, the global, let's say, to connect different scientific disciplines, what we call today multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches, that this is very important. Also his scientific collaboration, because Humboldtian science is very, let's say, comparative. He always establishes comparisons, but then to establish the comparisons, he needed to collaborate with a lot of people. He needed a lot of different data. So he was constantly comparing and collaborating with people. And he was also trying to establish big government-sponsored huge projects, huge science projects, and drawing together different countries. And this is something that he tried to do in his times, and we become aware that more and more that this is very important, that this is what needs to be done. So let's say his approach, his global and holistic approach, is what we see in the last years, and what we see it now in the current situation, also with the pandemic, with the research that needs to be undertaken, and also, well, the transatlantic connections, that this is very important. So this is something he strengthened in his time, and then there was a gap in between, but now people become more and more aware that he has been very important. But what I would like to focus on, because I always like to mention that many times Humboldt, what he writes, what we can find in his publication, etc., he draws together material from different sources. So not all what we find in his work has been, let's say, expressed first time by Humboldt. Many times it's the ideas of other people that he connects, he brings them together, he brings that to a different level. So that's why I don't want to say that before Humboldt, people were not thinking in a holistic way, or were not establishing great networks. So other people did that as well. But sometimes Humboldt, he had, let's say, he had all the channels open. So whatever he said, whatever he wrote would be published and reprinted in different journals, etc. So that's why he had such a great outreach. In the context of the commemoration last year, the 250th anniversary that had been celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic. So there was also one of the questions was, not to leave Humboldt as a historic figure in the past, but to connect him to the challenges of our times, or to see what of his thinking is still important to us today. This is what happens sometimes in history. I mean, the ideas have to be they have to fit in the time, and sometimes an idea might not fit in the context at one time, and people pass over it or forget it, but then it fits again at another time. And this is what happens now. When we see again that specializing too much into one field without being aware of the whole of the global aspect is something we should not do.
Great.
Do we have more questions?
Yeah, a couple more if you're still up for it. One is, do you have any more specifics on where he may have visited in Georgetown?
No. No, I don't. Okay. But what I can recommend is really to look at Peel's selected papers. and to look at his own descriptions of the travels from his diaries, but also from his autobiography. So I don't know if there's something, because I've been really looking for that information. Maybe something slipped from my attention. Yeah. So have a look, but I think right now I don't remember anything else. But anyway, it's very interesting to read that, yeah, and it's interesting to read it because, well, he gives his comments, and we can live. We can see Humboldt's travels through Peele's eyes and through Peele's comments. So that is sometimes even funny. So I can recommend having a look.
Great. Could you say a few words about Humboldt's relationship with the church?
With the church?
Is that a whole nother lecture?
Yes, that is the topic for another lecture. To make it interesting, intriguing, that lecture, I give a tiny little introduction. Humboldt was not against church as long as church would not interfere with science. I think that might be a short definition. To get explain a bit better is he has been criticized, and especially in the United States, he has been criticized many times for, let's say, describing the nature and talking about the cosmos without mentioning the creator, without drawing a connection to God. So this is what he has been criticized for. To understand that better is, again, he did not write against or express himself against religious belief at all. But he had several times, he had experiences where, well, especially in Spain, but then also sometimes in Spanish America. So he had experiences where the religious dogma would prevent scientific research. And this is exactly what he wanted, because what he wanted to do is to do really scientific research, but taking away all the mythical impact, the dogmatic impact, the political impact also. You see, we're getting into a broad field. It's really broad. So for example, he very much argued against the Buffon's theories about the inferiority of the New World. That was something that was much discussed in Europe, in the philosophical and scientific circles, so basically everything in America, North and South America, is inferior, and the weather, the climate is inferior, and the animals, and that also has an impact on the people. So these were the theories that were circulated, but Humboldt, he was totally opposed to that. But again, as a scientist, because he wanted to, instead of doing, let's say, a philosophical debate about that, what he wanted to do is to get the data, to really get the data. It's a bit what Jefferson also did in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, to get the data, and then you compare, you contrast, and you get a real answer. So that is something related to, or there's something similar in the case of religion as well. So if religion or religious dogma would prevent him from going deeper into a research question, or not being able to use certain instruments, or not being able to publish something, then he would oppose to the religious dogma.
Now, while that was a great question, and thank you for the answer, the question, the follow-up to that was, the intent of the question was, what was Humboldt's relationship with Frederick Church? Not, yeah. So
okay. Now I understood the correction.
that was my fault. So thank you for clarifying. So we got two good questions out of that.
Yeah. Okay. No, it was Frederick Church was very much intrigued with Humboldt's writings, and then what he did is he followed Humboldt's travels in South America. He painted, basically he painted what Humboldt tried to describe with words, and tried to, in his famous paintings, he tried to to paint Humboldtian science in a way. So that's what he did, and that was something that, well, that connects to another topic, and this is, Humboldtian science. Humboldt, he always saw he saw the arts as a very important means to transmit knowledge. So knowledge should not only be transmitted through text, but also through visual approaches. And because for him also, let's say, understanding the nature is not only measuring it, but also, let's say, appreciating it, loving it, having let's say, a sentimental approach to nature. And that is something that that is can very much be seen in those paintings. And I know that at church he wanted to show Humboldt his the big canvas that he had prepared, and wanted to send it to Humboldt, to Berlin, but then he had found out that Humboldt had just passed away.
Well, our final question, with expedition problems, what did Humboldt do during the year 1790 to 1799? Kind of
okay. Well, he studied. He worked as a mining engineer. He undertook several smaller exploration voyages in Europe with different people, and especially the one with Georg Forster, the one I mentioned at the beginning, when they went to the Netherlands and to England and to France. So it was studying. It was still continuing with his education and working as a mining engineer. So he worked for the Prussian king. So he had let's say a government position as a civil servant, and worked there as a mining engineer. But he decided that he didn't want to continue that, because it would have been too narrow for him. So for him, what he aspired was much broader than just dedicating his time to one specific field. And this is why he left the position, and then decided to explore the world.
Well, thank you so much. I know you've inspired a lot of us to learn much more about Humboldt, and like we have put in the chat, Sandra's got some marvelous publications out, and one that is forthcoming. And so be sure to check out her website for additional information. And then the past lectures and parts of this American art exhibit at the Smithsonian that unfortunately has been closed for much of the pandemic has a lot of great content as well. So we encourage you to continue to explore your learning on Humboldt. And now you have, of course, given us a little research topic in Alexandria as well. So thank you so much for sharing the afternoon with us. This has been wonderful. Of course, we would love to have hosted you at the Lyceum last April, but this has been a fantastic program as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm glad that it was possible, not the way we had envisioned at the beginning. I would have loved to add a visit to Alexandria, but yeah, I'm very happy that we were able to do it this way. So thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for joining us, and please join us for future programs.